seminar. It's great to have you here on Friday morning. My name is Troy Richardson. Coming to you from the Indigenous peoples of what is now Virginia and North Carolina. I want to acknowledge our place here in the Cayuga territories. Again, welcome you to the opening of our seminar for the fall. I don't do this by myself by any stretch of the imagination, so I want to acknowledge and thank Ula Mansfield, as well as Natani Nota for their wonderful insights in helping me bring this seminar series together again this year. And likewise, I want to extend a welcome and a thanks to Carol Warrior for opening us this semester. I just want to, for those of you who are new to the setting, just want to give you a quick overview of the process here and what will happen for the early afternoon. So we will spend the first hour listening and hearing Carol's thoughts in a more formal type presentation. Then we are fortunate enough to be able to share lunch together with some more informal discussion after the question and comment period following Carol's talk. And then after lunch, we do move into a slightly more seminar type discussion for the students who are enrolled in the course. This is a course for credit, and it's a real privilege for the students who are enrolled in it to get another hour or so with our speakers to engage in a reading and a set of ideas that our speakers provide to us in advance. I greatly look forward to your participation, and I'll say a few words of introduction about Carol. Carol Warrior is recently joining us here at Cornell University as a postdoc fellow, and she will be joining the Department of English for 2016 and 2017 as an assistant professor. She's enrolled at the Middlechick Village Tribe, and I told her I was going to stumble, so let her know in advance. Dina Ina, Athabascan, and Ludic nations, as well as the A'anim communities, the Gayogohó communities in Montana. Before coming to Cornell, Carol taught in the Department of English and American Indian Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle, and has a broad range of interests, not only in literature, but activism, film, sovereignty, and material culture. So please help me welcome Carol to the American Indian Studies program and the seminar specifically.
Nani sit Carol Warrior, Ninanin, Ninin, Dina Ina Athabascan, Alutik. Ijahe at August, not Sawanin, Bibiti, now Atax. Gimihayan, Nyaweh, to the Cayuga and Haudenosaunee peoples here who welcome me to their territory, to their homelands. I aim to live here with respectful awareness that the landscape and waters are your beloved relatives, and that you are beloved to these beings in and of this place. And Yahweh to Troy Richardson, and Jolene, and the rest of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program here at Cornell for giving me the honor and privilege of sharing my ideas with you here today. And the lineup for the speaker series looks really exciting. I'm very excited to hear people like Patrick Wolf and Glenn Coulthard, and thank God thank Troy. Thank you, Troy. You didn't make me follow them. Speaking of Glenn Coulthard, sorry, I should have done that before. Whose work focuses on the decolonization and Indigenous resurgence. I'd like to paraphrase an imperative he offered in the conclusion of his essay, In Lighting the Eighth Fire. In it, he writes, quote, Indigenous societies need to find in our own transformative praxis the source of our liberation, end quote. For this talk today, I'd like us to think about how Indigenous narratives might help us determine and design our own transformative praxis. Instead of keeping traditional oral stories in the children's or folklorist corner, I want to dust them off and find out what wisdom they communicate to us today. In Native studies, we often talk about the problems that arise when knowledge transfer between generations gets disrupted. So I look to the old stories, to the words of the earlier generations for the worldviews and values they perpetuate, for their descriptions of what proved to be problems for our ancestors and how they solved their problems. And it's true that our ancestors dealt with some truly terrifying things, much as we do. So I focused on a particular villain from the old stories, a fearsome figure, because the problems we as Indigenous peoples face, what we grapple with today, seem to be caused by behavior that correlates so well with the behavior of this villain, the Wendigo. I entitled my dissertation, Bearing the Wendigo's Teeth, Fearsome Figures in Native American Narratives, and now my task is to turn this research into a book. In this work, I not only look at fearsome figures in traditional and contemporary Native American texts, but also at the antagonists and monsters that show up in non-Native American texts. It's not a big surprise that villains in settler colonial texts correlate, not always, but often, with Indigenous peoples. After all, a savage is inherently fearsome, and that's how we've been defined on many occasions. We know that this kind of discourse is used to make people think of Indigenous people as villains. It should come as no big surprise then that in Native American literature, fearsome figures behave very much like colonizers. These villains, or fearsome figures, seem to have features that differ a little bit from villains in popular culture, even though obviously there's some overlap. But in Native American stories, the villain's fearsomeness is especially derived from their behavior. And that behavior is almost always disrupts relationships and interrelationships. To do this, one of their many strategies is deceptive language that redefines or categorizes based on a worldview that conflicts with many Indigenous worldviews. The victim then becomes isolated before somehow becoming consumed. Again, in non-Native narratives, the villains often behave like the West's ideas about Native peoples, and in Native narratives, villains behave similarly to the West. In Western narratives, literature, film, or popular discourse, for example, villains often emerge from the disruption of ontological categories that are commonly accepted means of organizing ideas about the world. But where the boundary lines of these categories lie and how they're in relation to one another derives from a long celebrated Euro-Western philosophical and religious tradition that's culturally and even linguistically embedded in Latinate languages like English. These categories I mentioned and the boundaries around them are often organized as structural oppositions. Some familiar oppositions might be the sacred and profane, human and animal, organic, inorganic, male and female, good and evil, and even past and future, or inside and outside. But far and away, the most popular one for Western monsters is alive versus dead. Fearsomeness, or just anxiety, especially in Western narratives, often emerges when these boundaries are violated, as I said. When this rule is followed, it helps readers and viewers, especially with those with Western worldviews and values, vilify the antagonist and better identify with the protagonists. So I said when those monsters, as I said, when those monsters or those categories are crossed, people tend to get a little anxious, if not terrified. Here are some examples of some familiar monsters. I'm sure you can think of dozens of others that clearly embody the disruption of categorical boundaries, especially structurally opposed categories. Each of these break down some kind of a structural opposition, and we can talk about it more later if you want to, or if you're interested. This is still introductory. But what happens when we have different organizing principles and values underlying our narratives? What happens when we value individuals for the unique roles in the life of the community rather than self-centered individualism? What happens when, because of our worldviews, we don't see organic and inorganic as structural oppositions, but instead we perceive all things as related and part of the same energy, and non-human beings as relatives instead of simple resources? And further, what happens when time isn't thought of as progressing always forward, always linear, and always up? What happens then to the categories of dead and alive? Structural oppositions no longer hold in these cases. Values are different. So the rules for antagonism and protagonism in Indigenous narratives that are based on these worldviews shift. Many fearsome figures in contemporary Native American literature and film then often emerge from or are modeled on the worldviews and values that I mentioned that conflict with Indigenous worldviews. For example, Western worldviews that value expansionism or progress or anything that considers growth to be an inherent good as an end to itself is very different from the kind of growth that's part of a cycle, balanced by decline, death, decay, and regeneration, or sustainability, in other words. So again, I'm paying special attention to a particular fearsome figure that appears and reappears across many Native peoples' oral histories, although the figure is most often associated with Algonquian peoples and narratives. The figure is called Wendigo in Anishinaabe-Moine, or Wetiko in Cree, and I use both terms interchangeably. It has many, many names. The figure, I look at the Wendigo's habits, and the strategies that people use for defeating them. These strategies can help us develop models for dealing with some of today's Wendigos. The well-known work of social criticism, I should mention, called Columbus and Other Cannibals, The Wetiko Disease of Exploitation, Imperialism, and Terrorism by Lenape historian Jack D. Forbes, is another influential text for the way I've come to trace fearsomeness or villainy. Forbes describes Wetikoism as a disease with a hallmark characteristic of consuming the life of another for one's own private purpose or profit as the primary symptomatic behavior of this disease. Forbes gives hundreds of historical examples of how Wetiko disease manifests, its symptoms and its vectors. But before I go any further, for those of you who are hearing about Wendigos or Wetikos for the first time, I want to give you a primer. Wendigo or Wetiko refers to an anthropophagous, cannibalistic being, a human-eating being, that's associated with cold and ice, blinding snowstorms, and biting winds. They terrorize and paralyze people in these conditions and make them vulnerable to deception, confusion, isolation, and insatiable hunger. They have incredibly sharp teeth and a heart made of ice, and with each human they consume, they become more powerful. But when storytellers tell tales of Wendigos, they aren't always talking about a single Manitou or spirit. Human beings can go Wendigo, or they can become possessed by a Wendigo spirit in such a way that the spirit controls the person's perceptions and behaviors. That is, they retain their human appearance, but they begin to crave human flesh. That new Wendigo convert or host will then be so driven to satisfy their hunger that their only interest then is to hunt other human beings so that they can eat them or possess them. Wendigoism can thus spread from person to person. That is, sometimes the result is like those hierarchical pyramid scheme vampire collectives from popular culture, in that some victims are food, while other victims are subservient to the one who turned them, you know, with the boss bad guy above the rest. Again, it's inherently expansionist, like capitalism, or extremely virulent disease. So how do people get picked off by a Wendigo? There are lots of ways, but there are also some prominent themes in the stories, or preferred hunting techniques, if you prefer. I think of them as metaphors for what a person might experience today. For example, a person could become vulnerable to Wendigo through isolation during unusually cold, lean winters in which game is scarce. So provisions are a big intro to the Wendigo. The Wendigo lures someone, often a hunter, out into the woods and after game, and then causes the hunter to get hopelessly lost in a blowing storm, just completely disoriented. People can also unwittingly arouse the Wendigo's attention by showing disrespect to the animals, the spirits, and the environments that sustain the people. According to Howard Norman, who interviewed more than 150 Cree elders about Wendigos, this disrespect, quote, unbalances what elders call the old agreements and fragments or distorts this important set of relationships. Again, Wendigos attempt to ensure that the victims feel utterly alone, disoriented, cold, and lost, and going in circles, completely without sources to meet their basic human needs, until the victim becomes overwhelmed by a hunger for people, at which time they transform to a Wendigo, complete with a heart of ice. They might continue to appear to be human, although their thoughts and behaviors change. Human beings will appear to be typical food animals of the tundra or the boreal, like a ptarmigan, moose, or beaver. In other words, the Wendigo's perception is off. The usual dietary fare for humans becomes absolutely repulsive to them, while humans are perceived as appetizing. And that appetite becomes insatiable. It represents a complete shift in the individual's worldview. And they begin to eat every person they can without stopping. Every relationship they would have needed to meet their basic human needs is consumed or disrupted. As a metaphor, I see this as a warning. When Indigenous individuals become separated from their home communities, they can also become separated from the relationships and venues where transfer and reinforcement of Indigenous worldviews and values takes place. They become vulnerable to different narratives or discourses and ideologies based on the categories constructed through Western worldviews and values. In other words, isolation and disorientation can lead to reorientation, I guess. We can become vulnerable to assimilation or incorporation or to individualism and to greed. On the other hand, we could become so lost and disoriented that we are at risk, down and out, on the streets, and vulnerable to a more bloodthirsty kind of Wendigo. Many traditional Wendigo stories include a means of defeating a Wendigo. Melting their icy heart is one way. And contemporary ways of melting hearts is done by Indigenous peoples too, and in a variety of venues. One way is to resist the effect of isolation and disorientation. First, by routinely gathering together, both physically and discursively, and sometimes this happens on social networking, right? We construct a people united through place and for the most part through mutually respected and often shared worldviews. Some other specific strategies are the reaffirmation of kinship bonds, declarative reminders of continuous Indigenous place-based relationships in a particular region, including its urban areas, demonstrating continuity with Indigenous aesthetic heritages, and disturbing rigid stereotype notions of authenticity and what indigeneity is. To keep this from being too abstract, I want to talk about an example of contemporary Wet'suwet'ism and the community's response to said Wet'suwet'ism as it played out on the streets of Seattle and in the media several years ago. My purpose is to show you that the isolation and dislocation that the Wet'suwet'en discourse causes can be resisted and disempowered once the people become alerted to its presence. My example begins with a murder that took place on August 30th, 2010, when on-duty police officer rookie Ian Burke took the life of John T. Williams, a Nuu-chah-nulth woodcarver of the Dididot Nation in British Columbia, whose repertoire of at least 250 designs, along with their traditional stories, have been passed on to him by his ancestors. Shortly after reports of the shooting surfaced, police and news media commentary emphasized Williams' mental illness, his chronic inebriation, and his criminal record. Some media outlets broadcast edited footage of earlier police interactions with Williams with accompanying commentary from Burke's attorney, who encouraged viewers to think of Williams as a dangerous individual. When the story was picked up by other news media beyond the region, they had Burke's attorney's commentary accompanying the report, where he claimed that John Williams' behavior alone caused his tragic end. Terrorized by the shooting and outraged at such attempts to blame the victim by constructing Williams and other Native American people who live on the streets in Seattle as slaughterable, Seattle area urban natives and their allies countered these justifications for the murder and for the discursive diminishment of Williams' humanity. We did so by claiming Williams as our brother. As the community collectively worked through the stages of grief, natives living in and around the area exposed, countered, and protested the shooting and other violent colonial actions that end or otherwise circumscribe Native lives, acts occurring particularly in Seattle, but also across the Pacific Northwest more broadly, and acts occurring indeed across the hemisphere. Some of us took video and photos of police officers harassing Native street people and protesters. We held signs, we marched, we held carve-ins where people gathered with their jackknives to carve wood in public spaces. We put on plays and spoken word performances, held community meetings where we confronted police officer Chief Diaz and other city officials. We created a working group on police relations with the Native population. In other words, the community turned up the heat until the discourse changed. Eventually, an internal firearms review board found the shooting unjustified and egregious. Out of respect for John T. Williams and to complicate what Dean Rader calls the aesthetic resistance of Native artists, poets, authors, and musicians, it's important to recognize that the woodcarver himself also challenged prescribed and policed categories, both aesthetically and existentially, and for that he paid the ultimate price. It's true that on occasion John presented a problem for public service providers, but not on that day. And many of us identify with that position, or we have brothers and sisters, or aunts and uncles, or cousins who do. And if the video works, I'd like to share a poem about John T., performed and written by John's good friend, Rick Williams, his brother's friend, and my good friend, poet Stormy Weber. I believe you have copies of her poem there. She identifies with the position of feeling alone and vulnerable because of the kind of marginality that John suffered. This poem underscores what I'm saying about category crossers and policed categories.
At the intersection of manifest and destiny, a man fell. He wasn't a big man. He wasn't driving a Ferrari. Wearing diamonds like P. Diddy or these other people he's supposed to want to be. He was a man who fallen and rose again and didn't surrender his life to all the sadness he'd seen. Somebody like us. He's walking through that intersection of custard and bad water. Or was it fire water and smallpox blankets? It's hard to remember, there's so many roads. Another young cavalry officer, or was it a policeman, saw him carving it because telling stories in wood is not something good in our time anymore, impossible to tax. And besides, didn't we already kill you people? I believe we deserve an apology for your continued existence. You don't go with anything in my condo. You breathed on my beds. Didn't we kill you people already? Somewhere between a nation of immigrants and a noble savage, John T. fell, splintered, and stories ran from his carver's hand. We are asked to feel sympathy for Ian Burke, 27 years of life, leading him to stop his police car and kill a man in 1 minute flat. Ian, if you were that scared of a half-deaf, nearsighted, limping native wood carver minding his own business, you should have stayed your stupid ass in your car. I was born to an alley mixed-blood lesbian mother and an African-American Choctaw bisexual father. I grew on these streets. Spent my life vanishing, at risk. Crossing the bridge of rised up fallen fighters, crossing over forever, crossing over. Thank you, that's it.
I hope this doesn't loop. It loop. Okay, that's not working. All right, good. So I'm not providing a close reading of that. That was just an example of the many, many different expressions of support for John and identification with him in his situation that was expressed during that period. But as her poem expressed, as agents of monopolization of legitimate violence, police discipline bodies to that categorical conformity. And John, like many marginalized people, did not stay within the neatly demarcated borders of normal behavior. To them, John was a fearsome figure. The existential threat posed by Williams as the possessor of a racializable body, an indigenous body with an unsteady gait, a body that manifests indigenous presence rather than banishment, would trigger an expansionist or Wetiko-like action from Burke, whose perception was off. He misread Williams' 3-inch jackknife as an instrument of savagery rather than a tool of creativity. Williams, along with his brothers and sisters, are 7th and 8th generation wood carvers, descended from people who, along with other indigenous peoples from as far away as Alaska, came to Seattle around the turn of the century, the 20th century, when their own economies were disrupted, to sell their creations to settlers. A highly respected occupation amongst Nuu-chah-nulth and Makah peoples, wood carvers like John Williams and his siblings are recognized by the region's indigenous peoples for the way that carvers carry and reproduce the stories and indigenous worldviews that perpetuate what it is to be of and part of that particular geographic place, rather than apart from or alien to the landscape. After his passing, John's brother Rick created a 34-foot story pole in his brother's honor. And on February 26, 2012, with four eagles circling overhead, and I counted them, the pole was raised by members of the Seattle's urban Native community and their allies. It stands now under the shadow of the Space Needle. During the year after the shooting, Seattle, let's see, sorry, I lost my place. During the year after the shooting, hundreds of people visited the carving site at Seattle's waterfront, and under Rick's guidance, took up carving tools, sandpaper, and paint, and helped to bring the stories on the pole to life. An Indian Country Today article notes that 90 people carried the pole from the waterfront to the Seattle Center, and that's quite a hike of hills and stuff. And they helped to raise it, confirming en masse appreciation for John T. Williams' life, insisting on the validity of his presence in Seattle, and reminding everyone that we do have community. We are not isolated. And another Indian Country Today journalist observed, quote, "It's fitting that the native imagery of the main pole was carried down these streets, home to native peoples now and since time immemorial, a history and a future that cannot be erased with a bullet." As Rick led the creation of John's memorial pole, his grief joined with the grief of hundreds of participants to reaffirm this time immemorial connection to the region, his family's historical connection to the city, and the legitimacy of the kind of border crossings that characterize his and his brother's lives. By extension, he has done the same for Indigenous peoples living in urban places across the nation and across the continent. The pole and all of the relationships that created it are both a reaffirmation of kinship bonds in an Indigenous way of understanding kinship, and constitute a declarative reminder of continuous place-based relationships in the region. Further, the stories that Rick Williams and other Indigenous poets, singers, carvers, dancers, and artists told during that time demonstrated continuity with Indigenous aesthetic heritages. Indigenous peoples continue to respond to the acts of domination with these creative works and collaborations that claim space in indigenous areas, and at the same time claim relatives through Indigenous ways of building and maintaining relatives and relationships. Doing so might begin with the use of stories, voice, art, testimony, and music from many traditions, but self-determination in urban settings is possible even when the group itself is made up of people from a variety of tribal nations. Such solidarity can challenge the validity of hegemonic Western categories and borders around identity, kinship, place, and bodies. It further unveils ideological and discursive deception of Wet'coism. In response to the pressure that the community exerted on the city of Seattle and their police department, the city was forced to retract their support of Burke, and Burke lost his job. But justice was not achieved. King County Prosecutor Attorney Dan Satterberg decided not to charge Burke with any crime, and the city of Seattle eventually paid the Williams family $1.5 million, which is now sitting in trust. But again, this isn't justice, and I'm not really sure that achieving justice in this system is possible. But I think that there's a reason for hope. The persistence of the people to reaffirm their relationships has had an amazing resurgent effect on the Native community in the city. And though it's not without its problems, it's now vibrant, dynamic, it has many allies, and is working collectively to take care of everyone's basic human needs, as well as any community can. Sometimes I think about how every corner of the world is in the maws of a cold-hearted Wendigo. There sometimes seems to be no way out of some of the predicaments we're in. And when it comes to voracious resource extraction, racism, violence, and the ever-growing creativity and power expansionists, this really hits home for me. So I look again to how the elders struggled and fought their way free from Wendigos. They had a variety of methods to kill Wendigos. And those are really interesting stories, but you know, it might send the wrong message if I were to advocate that kind of action today.
What do you mean?
I'm not advocating. But to cure a Wendigo is different. Far and away, the most commonly recorded way to cure a human-gone Wendigo, as I mentioned before, is to melt their icy heart. Ethnographer Howard Norman remarks that doing so, quote, reestablishes the equilibrium of the threatened village as opposed to the chaos and starvation caused by the Wendigo, end quote. And it doesn't require a superhero to do it, like sometimes the killing might have required a superhero for that. It's often family members of a human-gone Wendigo that does the curing, or a group of spiritual practitioners, or just ordinary people who care about their community. These are folks who are able, as a collective, to achieve this difficult task. But how did they do it? Well, in the stories, they didn't melt hearts through pathos, or through eliciting pity from the Wendigo. It was through pouring hot tallow down the Wendigo's throat, or by tricking them into swallowing a piece of hot coal, or my personal favorite, getting them into a sweat lodge. In other words, the people turned up the heat until the heart of the villain melted. And I think the message in these stories is that no matter how fearsome the villain is, our ancestors have faced terrible things too, and have told us stories about what might work for us. And I hope that you can find as much inspiration from their words as I have. Gani Hayan for listening to me today.
Thank you. So we'd like to open it up if there are any questions.
Hey, Carol, thanks.
Sure.
Great talk. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about some contemporary Native American novels that you feel obviously use Wendigos. I'm thinking immediately of Louise Erdrich's Roundhouse, but you're the authority on this, and just explain how they might, one or two of them might fit into this paradigm of development.
Right. Well, actually, what I did was I focused on literature that didn't have explicit Wendigos in them, because I wanted to show how this idea applied to fearsome figures that were not necessarily constructed to be interpreted as Wendigos. I wanted to use it kind of the way that Jack Forbes had used it, to look at social processes and to notice how different authors had created their villains, their fearsome figures, with those same consuming, voracious, and appetites and their discursive strategies. So in addition to Erdrich's The Roundhouse, there's Joseph Boyden's 3 Day Road has an explicit Wendigo figure in it. I think you could call one of the characters in Solar Storms is a Wendigo, but we don't really get that as explicitly, but you can trace it out in the text. They do mention it one time or something, or she mentions it once. I looked at several indigenous novels that were vampire stories, actually, the appropriation of the vampire, and at least one of them, Drew Hayden Taylor's The Night Wanderer, which I had the little jacket cover on one of the slides. The characters talked about Wendigo, but the character itself, that the vampire character, never admitted to being a Wendigo. He was not a Wendigo, he was a vampire. And there's a long list, actually.
I was wondering, like, when would because you mentioned that they're hard to kill, but when is it possible to kill them, and like when would a Wendigo have to be killed versus be cured?
Well, so they're a spirit, right? And so there are different kinds that show up in the oral stories. And one kind is not a human possessed by a Wendigo, but a Wendigo, a spirit. And so when they're out of control and their actions are disrupting the relationships in an area and maybe in a village, that prevents that village and those people from surviving. So it's different from like having a predator where there's, you know, because indigenous people have always had like wolves and bears and stuff that are eat humans, right? And they're not thought of as fearsome in that same way. But if it's just, you know, if they've attracted the attention of a Wendigo and a Wendigo is set on consuming everybody there, killing everybody, then a medicine person or some sort of a culture hero or a group of medicine people would set about to kill them.
I guess I was also thinking of the roundhouse. I know that's not specifically what you work on, but I was wondering, because in that book, at the end, there's like this idea that this character has to be killed because he's a Wendigo. So I was just wondering how that works.
Well, I'm gonna, confess I haven't read the Roundhouse. I'm about halfway through. Spoiler, right?
Sorry.
No worries. But there are cases, like court cases, where some individuals, some human beings, were actually had to be killed as well. The preference is for curing. Occasionally, when somebody in the record, when somebody begins to go Wendigo, sometimes they're aware of this transformation beginning in themselves, and they beg for being cured, or they'll beg to be killed. There's that, like I said, there's a really diverse set of strategies for dealing with Wendigo. But I'm just looking at like where everything sort of pools.
So kind of building off that question, and this is kind of a similar. There's a problem I was having with actually the Roundhouse also, but it kind of gets this idea of a difference between retributive and restorative justice, which is kind of like a different way of talking about these same issues, like within legal literature and that kind of stuff. But it also confronts like the binary that you presented in the beginning, which was about the idea of like there's this Western, there are Western binaries, right?
Yeah. And
there's a good and evil, fear and death, life and death, and that sort of thing. And so when you're talking about, toward the end of your presentation, you're talking about this being kind of having this discursive ideological elements to it, this Wendigo story, and especially how it's applied in the circumstance of Seattle. So in this case, you have kind of this retributive judicial system, where that's the ideology that you're confronting. You have law and order, and this person is being disordered. He fits in historical narratives of savagery and civilization and that sort of thing. I think that's what the poem is talking about. And so this Wendigo as a story, as an ideology, is countering that, it sounds like. And it's building, as you said, kinship ties and alternative communities in a contemporary space, not necessarily like as like fundamentalist traditional understanding, but a contemporary application of these stories. But it seems to also incorporate this retributive justice element to it, where like things have to be killed, like things. It's like this person or this entity sinned, and it has to be destroyed. And the restorative element to it is a little bit different, or it's unclear, I guess.
In which story has
the Wendigos? In this Wendigo narrative.
Which one?
And that's kind of built. It's like the exact same question.
The Roundhouse?
Yeah, well, just the way that you described it. Like you have both. You can kill the Wendigo with coal, like shoving coal down his throat. Or
that's a cure.
Oh, that's a cure. Oh, okay. So. All right. Well, maybe I thought about that.
That's a cure.
So,
not always. Cures don't always feel so good.
Good point. Yeah. So do you think that this is would you characterize it more as a restorative justice approach to a pathologies and social pathologies.
Okay, well, I see what you're saying. I think that there's not a division between, in the stories, really between, I wouldn't characterize them as retribution, killing the Wendigo as retribution. I don't think that when the Wendigo's body is killed, that the spirit is gone. It just comes back, you know, it's part of this cycle. It just sort of, I don't think there's any way to stop that kind of overconsumption kind of a thing, or punish it. You see what I'm saying? I don't think that the binary applies there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Does that answer?
Yeah.
And so I think that what the people in Seattle are doing are, they're attempting, we were attempting restorative justice, and I really don't know what it would have looked like if the Nuu-chah-nulth people and the Duwamish people, these are the two peoples who were most directly involved in, like, as far as like protocols go, like whose people would be most have the most say as to like what retribution or what justice or what restoration would look like, right? I'm not sure what any of that would really look like if they had their say. When we were in all the discussions and the community meetings afterwards, I wasn't seeing, the people who were raising the issue of retribution, or like had that more I don't know what kind of, had that kind of a goal in mind, were not people from the region. They were people they're actually people from AIM, who came up from California, and people, or Colorado, I think. And not to say that there's anything wrong with AIM, I'm just saying that these particular people were from AIM. And then there was a group of, I think it was Mothers Against Police Violence, or some group that's a national group, that came in with a program that they wanted the community to sign on to, that was really interested in retribution and that kind of thing, but they were not interacting with the community according to community protocols, and so people didn't show up to their rallies and their meetings and stuff. It was really a really wide awareness, even from those of us who were not Coast Salish, or not Nuu-chah-nulth, or not Makah. So like who had the say, you know, who had the say over what the community, I guess they were like the ones who we were looking to for like, what do you want, and then coming to consensus about it. Not that there was ever like complete consensus, but they were the ones leading. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the talk. I wanted to ask something, sort of, it might follow from what Andrew was asking about, it might not. You can sort of take it wherever you want. But you started out talking about binaries and how sort of villains in both sort of native stories and settler stories trouble binaries, and that's what makes them disturbing. But it seems to me the Wendigo kind of reverses binaries almost. And I was just really struck by this poem that you introduced to us, right? Because there are moments where binaries are, you know, at the intersection of manifesting destiny, somewhere between a nation of immigrants and a noble savage, and then the sort of poet identifies herself as an African-American Choctaw, you know,
Yeah.
ancestry. And so it got me thinking, I've been, for weird reasons, thinking about zombies lately, right? And if you do the etymology of zombies, right, you can go back to Zumbi dos Palmares, right, the leader of the first free republic in the Americas, which was, you know, an escaped African community that mixed with indigenous people there. Now actually the Brazilian government, to trace kind of native ancestry, has to go through people who sort of phenotypically look African, but actually carry sort of native DNA with them. And so I guess at one, I'm asking a question that operates on two levels. One is how, maybe you could say something about how native stories, because, you know, in kind of classic villain hero stories, the hero is also sort of compromised in the binary between good and evil. So I'm a political theorist, I'm not good with literature at all. But you think about somebody like Machiavelli's The Prince, right? You have to be a man, and you have to be a wolf, and a lion, and a fox, and all these different things, and the binary is slippery there. But to be a heroic, virtuous prince, conversely, villains, zombies are between alive and dead. They're sort of racially ambiguous, though we know they're sort of associated with slave revolts historically. And so how maybe on the sort of activist level or the sort of social process level, hero villain stories, especially in urban settings where sort of authentic indigeneity and authentic identity can't really be pinned down because urban spaces are sites of sort of recombination and activism, how, maybe urban activism between Native communities and often like urban Black communities or, Latin American immigrant communities is sort of working, as far as you understand from an activist perspective as well.
Okay, so, the question.
The question is, yes, does that make sense sort of on an intellectual level
Absolutely.
of troubling binaries in terms of what is authentically indigenous and not, and then at an activist level, do you think this is a sort of helpful basis for
Yeah.
coalition building when other people are obviously facing gun violence,
Yeah,
depending
yeah.
on the population?
So I hope I'm understanding your question correctly, but I think that absolutely the poem and the indigenous stories and even the oral tradition is always working in these spaces, not even spaces, it's always process, movement and exchange and growth cycles that we're all part of, I guess. And I think that's a real strength for indigenous activists and the Native communities within urban areas. I think that lack of specificity in an urban space is important. And I know that's kind of, I had to qualify that. You have people from all different backgrounds, as you were saying, allied to work together. And you have various levels of cultural competency from everybody's own background and in what's these old relationships to that place that are there. But what's really cool, I think, or what I saw and what I experienced is that when you're together a lot, working together, there's this exchange constantly of what the protocols are that are in that place. And people are adapting their own protocols and finding ways that they can work together. I don't know if I'm answering this right.
No, it's actually very productive.
Okay, and it's like nobody was trying to say, oh, that person isn't Indian enough or marginal enough or Coast Salish enough to speak on this topic. I mean, there wasn't that going on. It was just like when I mentioned the one group that came in from elsewhere, they were working on police violence. That was what they weren't getting. That's what they were not recognizing was that protocol. They were coming at it from this racialized, a race and racism sort of an issue where the community that's there was dealing with it as like a nation, not really a nation, but like these are I want to say old relationships to place with old ways of thinking about crossing boundaries. Like it's more like I often use that, I think I even did in a writing that I gave to your seminar people. I think of it as tethering to a place rather than being boundaried. So people are moving all around and aware of how to move in these spaces and what their status is in these different spaces and their relationships to the different people. They know who they are and in relation to, like, they know who's tethered more closely. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, it seems productive for what you said at the end, maybe what Andrew was getting to as well, with this question of justice. Like,
Mhm.
could there possibly be justice in
Yeah.
the system that Burke was sort of administered by?
Right.
And yet you have these sort of different traditions, whether it's a land-based tradition or a sort of spiritual, aesthetic-based tradition, like this poet was bringing Black traditions of oratory, music, and poetry, and to these new practices of justice, sort of
Yeah.
aesthetically and socially.
I don't know if I answered that.
I wanted to bring you back a little bit to how you conceptualize your academic work in terms of storytelling, because I think storytelling, there's so many layers of storytelling in the talk you gave. So you began by saying you're turning back to the old stories, and then
I should have done that. Directional thing.
and then I feel like part of what this community was doing in the case of John T. Williams was telling stories about him as a way to reintegrate him into a kind of community, as a way of turning up the heat. And then you're telling this story of that activism as a way to get to this intellectual problem of the Wendigo. And you know, I mean, maybe it has to do with kind of countering these kind of sort of typical Western academic discursive strategies, or maybe it's something else. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about maybe how you see storytelling as part of your academic practice.
Right. Okay. Well, I consider myself a really terrible storyteller. I really admire good storytellers. But I'm trying to look at what I do as always telling a story. I think they are able to bring people into, or at least be help people become aware of the relationships that they're in. And I think that that's a problem, I think, in contemporary society, is that people are, you know, often oblivious to most of their relationships, except for like their most, you know, nuclear family or their sweethearts or their best buddies. But there are unlimited relationships that everybody is in, and I think that the storytelling brings us back to that. I also kind of resent the way that storytelling has been characterized and thought of as not academic, really, or sort of a childish activity, or not something that is scholarship. So I want to go to it. Does that help? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for giving the first presentation, giving such an interesting presentation. And welcome again.
Thank you.
I want to take you slightly in a different direction, beyond your paper. You ended by saying it was not justice. Justice was not achieved. And so clearly you had some criteria for what justice is. And then, as a good scholar, you admitted that I don't know what it would look like, because we really have to consult the two communities that were involved in what they constitute justice. And I was paying careful attention to your words, because this was a situation that creates anger. And there were moments when there was anger, but you didn't use those words, you let the poet express them. You didn't yourself engage in it. Whether that was an academic point or whether that was your personal choice is really not an issue. Because here's where I would like you to go and engage you on this. The issue of the murder that took place and the young rookie implicated because not taking the time to think. Really not taking the time to think, but resorting to a quick response, is an issue that matches today. Today is September 11th. And the Americans, in a move to unleash revenge, have caused havoc all over the planet. And literally from East Africa, from the Middle East to Central Asia, to right here at home, unleashed havoc. So unleashed the Indigo, as you described it. So I would like to press you to describe characteristics of how a cure is achieved when the Indigo is unleashed on a massive scale, like in Seattle or on September 11th. And press you to talk about aspects of how communities can move in that direction, specifically. And to press you to describe what justice may look like.
Well, if I had the answer, I would have gone there already.
No, I'm not asking you to give me an answer, I'm asking you to give us your considered perspective.
So, I think the scale of Wendigo that you're talking about is really different from the scale that I was talking about in my presentation. And that was an intentional choice because I want to find out how to disempower a Wendigo on that scale. In the stories, one of the techniques that I've seen in many different people's stories, the killing of a Wendigo, and we're talking about a very, very large Wendigo, not a human-sized Wendigo at all. Something that swallows everything in its path, not just human beings, but everything. They often get some brave person, usually it's a culture hero, will want to help. And they trick the Wendigo into swallowing them. It's very much like the Jonah and the whale story. They trick the Wendigo into swallowing them, and then it's like Coyote or somebody, or Toyas, like Boy in the Blackfeet tradition. And then they either, or it might be Wolverine or Ermine or somebody like that, will bite the heart or stab the heart of this Wendigo. So it's kind of like this double agent thing. You go in and you destroy it from the inside. And I haven't figured out a way where that's possible, but I've seen that even in contemporary fiction, native fiction, where that's a technique for these big problems. But I don't know, like specifically how that could be done, or who would have that kind of grit, I guess, or power. But I'm thinking, I think that with the police brutality that we've been seeing lately, not just brutality, but the murders, I'm going to just call them murders, that we've been seeing, there has been a lot of pressure put on different communities, or different police forces, and I think I read just a couple of days ago that this week 5 different police officers have been finally formally charged with murder. And this is sort of unprecedented in the U.S. So there, all this pressure that different communities are putting on their police forces for this kind of violence is beginning to change the story. It's beginning to change the discourse a little bit. So I think pressure is really important, this heat. And I've kind of gone to the end of what I was thinking when you were asking the question, so.
That's fine.
Can I, yeah, I don't know if the lunch is here. Maybe Jolene can be our last comment or question.
Any of the other grad students have a question? Okay, I'll be happy to ask a quick question. Carol and I are in a wonderful seminar with the Mellon Diversity this semester, and we're dealing with this notion of, just very simply put, this what is evil in some way. That's at the center of it. But so what I'm wondering, Carol, is the Wendigo is a regulatory spirit in the community, and one of the things that I get troubled over is that it's an incredibly powerful thing, being in the world for many Indigenous peoples, but it's in the world at large, and I think that's your point. But it's unnamed and unmarked, or maybe loosely configured as this notion of evil. But one of the things I wonder about, and this really comes out of interviewing artists that depict these spirits and how complicated it is negotiation depending on how they're located within their communities about these depictions, or these representations. What are your feelings about bringing these ideas out, making them present in a world that doesn't really have a place to put them, other than fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer. I think a lot of this came about because I felt like I was so overwhelmed by so much trouble in the world. And it seemed like every avenue for resistance was being controlled, was also being consumed. You know what I mean? Like, you can't even pick up your phone and call somebody and make plans without being, aware that, panopticism is controlling everything, or controlling you, essentially. So I got to thinking about, well, what do we have that they don't have? What are our resources that they don't have? What can we turn to that they don't have, they don't get? And so that's why I was looking at, well, they don't, there's a lot they don't get, about, because of the worldview that we have and our practices. And I do get nervous because when you put it out there, it could be just appropriable and turned into something else, right? And consumed yet again. But at the same time, I was thinking that during the I Don't Know More movement, a lot of the people were saying, well, we really need to start listening to our women, and we really need to start listening to our elders. That's something that we haven't been doing. And this is where I saw at least the elders that I knew that were, it was, I hope this doesn't bother anybody, but pre-missionary period, had recorded what they were, what their thoughts were, what their ideas were at the time. And so that's where I went. And I'm not really, I'm actually kind of nervous about it, to tell you the truth. But I also don't, I think it's only post-missionary that this creature has been, or this being has been called evil.
That's a really important point for me, yeah.
I don't think it's, I really don't think it's,
It was quite
Evil.
thought of in that way.
no, I think it's,
Yeah. It's interesting.
like a dog, you know, you can't call a dog evil, it's just a dog. You know, the dog's gonna do what the dog's gonna do. Except for Cujo, is that what you said? Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, as I said, we do have lunch, and we can certainly continue the conversations informally over lunch. So please let's thank Carol again for her.
Part of the lecture.
About ALH.